person you've all come to. All yours.
Hey, I'm Nick Harker. I'm a local herpetologist. If anyone's been to any of my other talks, it's exactly the same. So apologies in advance if you've already heard it. Just a quick little bit about me. So I'm a herpetologist and ecologist, and I've worked for a range of companies as well as for DOC and NPI doing lizard work around the country. I've been working with native lizards primarily for over a decade now, and I've done a bit of work with various species throughout the country. And I've been New Zealand Herpetological Society president since 2018. So this is a bit of a summary of my talk. So firstly, I'll talk about lizards as a taxonomic group. Then I'll talk about New Zealand lizards, why they're special and what role they play in the ecosystem. Then a little bit about their conservation status and the threats they face. A little bit about how we survey and monitor for different species in New Zealand. A little bit about the local species that occur around Auckland and how to identify them. And hopefully I'll keep my talk to around like 30 or 40 minutes, and at the end I've brought a few lizards along for you guys to meet. So firstly, what is a lizard? So if you think about the group reptiles, which is a class of animals, there's 4 different orders of reptiles. So you've got the crocodilia, which are the alligators and crocodiles. You've got the chelonia, which are the turtles and tortoises. And then you've got the rhynchocephalia, which are the tuatara. And they're all by themselves, so they're not a lizard. We're not going to be talking about them today. But they're a very ancient group that sort of predate the dinosaurs and used to be hyper diverse, but now the only species we've got left looks very much like a lizard, but it isn't. And so what we're going to be talking about today are the squamates, which are these guys here, snakes and lizards. Snakes and lizards are very closely related. They're in the same order. So what makes a lizard? They're usually quadrupedal, but obviously we know there's exceptions to all those rules, and some of you might have seen legless lizards at some of the zoos around the country. And they also have a keratinous skin or scales, and that's obviously just you know, a lot of species will live in arid environments. That's to help them kind of protect themselves from losing a lot of moisture through their skin. But even in that case, there's some lizards that have quite a lot of transmission of water through their outer membrane, depending on what habitat they live in. And lizards are also ectotherms. So that's a fancy word for what a lot of people call cold-blooded. And what it basically means is that they don't produce their own body heat like we do with their endotherm. All mammals are endotherms. Ectotherms rely on the sun and external sources of heat, and that regulates their entire metabolism. So lizards are only really active when things are warm, and during winter or colder periods, they're usually quite inactive. And this makes them very efficient animals because they're not using very much energy, producing their own body heat. And so yeah, what this guy here will be doing, this is an Otago skink from Otago in the South Island. And how they regulate their body temperature is he'll live in that little rock crevice just behind him, and he'll sort of shuttle in and out of the sun throughout the day. And so if he's feeling a little bit cold, he'll come out into the sun, and then when he's feeling warm enough, he'll retreat. And by doing that, they can kind of keep their body temperature roughly at the same temperature throughout the day. So if we're talking about New Zealand lizards, we don't have the massive taxonomic diversity that you might see overseas. So we don't have chameleons or iguanas or monitors. But what we do have is lots and lots of geckos and skinks. So I think the most recent tally is about 130 species of geckos and skinks in New Zealand, which is was the last time I checked the highest species richness per unit land area for a temperate region in the world. And that number keeps changing because New Zealand lizard taxonomy, it's a very contentious issue, and some people can't decide what is and isn't a species. So we've got around 130 at the moment, but that seems to change every year. And the spread of those 130 is that we've got roughly sort of 60% skinks and 40% geckos of that 130. Our geckos arrived, I believe it was about 80 million years ago. And the skinks arrived relatively more recently. So the geckos, even though there's fewer species, they're much more diverse, and so there's 7 different genus or genera of geckos, but there's only one skink genus. However, they're very diverse within each of those groups, and they now occupy basically every habitat from the littoral zone. So you've got species like the egg-laying skink here, the top right. They live right on the edge of the ocean, so on pebble beaches, and they're strictly nocturnal, and they're mainly on islands now. But if you're anywhere where they exist, it's quite cool. You can go out at night, and they're often foraging right where the waves are crashing on top of them. And another cool thing about these guys is they're actually semi-aquatic, so they can hold their breath for up to 20 minutes, and they'll often dive into rock pools and forage for things like little crabs and isopods underwater. And then the extreme opposite of that scale, you've got this guy here, which is black-eyed gecko, which you find in the Kaikoura ranges and parts of the Kahurangi area. And they live about 2,200 meters above sea level. So for half of the year, their habitat is just completely covered with snow. And they're so what this means for the geckos is that they're only active over summer, and they have to eat all the food they need over that 5-month period. And for the rest of the year, they're just hiding under a rock, under the snow, until it melts. So yeah, we've got some pretty cool species, and you can find them basically everywhere. And they also have some very unique features due to having evolved in a New Zealand climate and New Zealand ecosystem. So the first thing, which I'm sure many of you have heard about, is that all of New Zealand geckos and all but one of our skinks, which is the egg-laying skink in the previous slide, are live bearing. So we call this ovoviviparous or viviparous. And what it means is that the females kind of retain their eggs inside them, and then they hatch and they give birth to live young. But it's more complicated than that, because researchers are finding more and more there's some kind of maternal nutrient transfer between the mother and the developing embryos inside. So it's a very interesting strategy, and the thoughts behind that are that if you're a lizard living in a cold climate and you lay eggs, when it gets cold, the eggs might die. But if you keep them inside of you, you can move around wherever it's warm and it's going to be suitable for the eggs to hatch. So it's kind of a more advantageous in that way. What this does mean, though, is that because they're having to carry their offspring to full term, they have a very slow life history. So all of our geckos and skinks only breed a maximum of once a year. Some of them take around 10 years to reach maturity, some of them potentially even longer. And some of them only breed maybe once every 2 years or potentially once every 4 years. There's a species on Stewart Island called a harping gecko, which we think might have a 2-year pregnancy, which is pretty incredible for a little lizard. And also longevity. Many of our species are very, very long lived, so it's not uncommon for a lot of our geckos and skinks to get 50 years old or older. They've even found them in the wild at that age, doing population monitoring. And in captivity, they can obviously live even longer, and there's some Durvacell's geckos that people believe are around 70 years old based on records. So that's pretty incredible, and it's kind of insane when you compare them to species overseas, which might only live like 5 to 10 years. So yeah, these are all things that make our lizard special. And then telling the difference between geckos and skinks. So there's a few different things to look for. I've listed 4 of them there. So you've got your body shape, skin, eyes, and your feet and toes. So skinks, very sleek looking. They're kind of like a snake with legs. They've got these overlapping fish-like scales, which give them a kind of a shiny look. And another good way to remember the difference between geckos and skinks is that skinks blink and geckos don't. So skinks have a lower eyelid which they can use to close their eye, whereas geckos never blink. They have this transparent scale that covers their eye called a spectacle, and to keep that clean, they just lick it with their tongue, which, you know, a lot of people like to get photos of geckos doing that. It's quite cool. And yeah, geckos compared to skinks are quite chunky. They've got a distinct head and neck. Their skin is very soft and baggy. If you touch them, it's almost like velvet. They're very soft. Obviously, no eyelid. They've got the spectacle. And then a major difference is also in the toes. So geckos are quite famous for having these sticky toes. And what it actually is if you turn over a gecko's foot and look underneath, you'll see they have these rows of scales called lamellae. And they're quite useful actually for distinguishing between some species which are very similar. You can count them, and it's sometimes different between species. But the importance of what makes them stick is that they're covered in lots of tiny little hairs called setae. And what they do is they basically massively increase the surface area of the foot. So it's almost like you can imagine if you put your finger on the table and move it across, it's a lot easier than if you put your whole palm on the table and try to move it. So they basically like creating this massive surface area to allow them to stick to walls, and some of them can even walk up glass, which is pretty cool. I added this slide in because every time people ask me about this afterwards, and I never used to have a slide about it, but so lizards dropping their tails. The fancy word for this is caudal autotomy. So caudal means tail, and autotomy means self-amputation. So firstly, why do lizards do this? Obviously, it's a predator avoidance strategy. And you'll quite often see lizards that maybe have a bird or a cat stalking them. They like to wiggle their tail, or sometimes they have a quite brightly coloured tail. And that's to draw the predator's attention away from the important bits, which are, its body and its head, because they can afford to lose the tail, even though it's quite important for fat storage at certain times of year. But usually, they'll drop the tail will be where the predator will come and eat the tail, and the lizard will make a quick getaway. The interesting thing is, how do they do this? So within a lizard's tail, there's a series of vertebrae, obviously, and within each vertebra is a fracture plane. So the lizard, as I suggested with the name self-amputation or autotomy, they can decide where along the tail to break it off. So it's not a case of the predator, touching the lizard's tail or pulling it off. The lizard actually consciously makes a decision about where it breaks off, and it breaks off within the vertebra. So it's kind of hard to see from this X-ray, but you can see there's one vertebra there, and then this is a little half one. So the lizard would have dropped its tail about there. And then what happens afterwards is that the tail never grows back the same. So instead of growing back bone, they grow back this cartilage rod with all the muscles surrounding it. And the pattern is usually quite different, so you can often tell when a lizard has dropped its tail before. So moving on, talking about the role that lizards play in the New Zealand ecosystem. So this is quite cool. Most people don't realise that lizards can be quite important pollinators of native plants. So, for example, species like Purakawa, there's a theory that plants with flowers, they have a similar structure to that, may have co-evolved with geckos for pollination. So you can see this guy here, this Rokawa gecko. On islands, these guys will often come out at night to feed on the nectar of Purakawa flowers, and they produce the nectar down the bottom. So the gecko has to stick its head right into the base of the flower to get at the nectar, and ends up with a bunch of pollen stuck over its face and its nose and its chin, and then moves between different flowers and provides quite an important ecosystem function by acting as a pollinator. Geckos have quite a sweet tooth, so and skinks as well. They quite like nectar and also berries, and so that's another important thing that our lizards do is seed dispersers. So mostly skinks, but some geckos quite like the berries of certain species of plants. And any plants which have a blue or a white berry, the current theory is that those are specifically evolved to have lizards as seed dispersers, because birds prefer berries which are, bright oranges and reds and sort of stand out as things that they like to eat. But little blue and white berries seem to be preferred by lizards, which is quite interesting. And there's also a few plants which produce berries underneath all the foliage, so a bird wouldn't be able to see it, but a lizard would be able to sort of crawl underneath and get to them. So yeah, we're finding out more and more about this every year as people do more research. And then obviously they're predators in the environment. They're eating a lot of invertebrates, so flies and moths and cockroaches, and some of the bigger ones will eat smaller lizards. And a very big skink called a robust skink has been recorded eating seabird chicks as well, which is pretty appealing. They're obviously also prey, so a lot of our birds will eat lizards, like pukeko, weka, kiwi will eat lizards. I've heard tui sometimes will catch geckos, but they're also eaten by things like tuatara and giant centipedes as well. Which is pretty grim if you see a giant centipede eating a lizard. And another interesting but kind of weird thing is that they can be scavengers. So there's a rock stack off Four Knights with a colony of gannets, and there's a couple of species of lizards that live there. There's a species called a Four Knights gecko, and there's shore skinks that live on the island too. And what they often do out there is they'll wait for the mum or dad gannet to come back to feed the chicks. And then if anything spills out, when the parents are regurgitating food into the chick's mouth, the lizards just rush out from under rocks and eat the bits of fish and stuff and squid that they're able to vomit it up, which is pretty gross, but it's resourceful of those lizards. And it only seems to be certain types of lizards living in those kind of habitats that do this. But yeah, you might think, what impact can just a few lizards have? We don't see many around, you might see the odd little skink in your garden, but there's not heaps around. However, if you go to predator-free islands, there's lizards everywhere. This is a bait station on Whale Island off Whakatane, and every bait station had a colony of like 30, 40 geckos living in it. This is a tree on the Mercury Islands that was producing honeydew. It was covered in scale insects, and likewise, it was just covered in geckos at night, going for the sweet honeydew. And some of these islands you go to, it's kind of insane. You're almost tripping over lizards at night. You're having to watch where you're walking so you don't stand on them. But obviously, before humans arrived and brought all these pests with them, lizards were everywhere. Just massive densities, and they would have been very, very important just by their sheer abundance in the environment. And so, why are they in trouble now? Around 80% of our lizards are at risk or threatened with extinction, so it's quite a high percentage. And the reasons why are, the same as a lot of our species, the same as our birds, invasive species. So, rats, cats, stoats, possums. And the reason why they're an issue for our lizards is that they evolved to deal with bird predators, avian predators. And the difference between them is that birds are looking for their food, they're visual predators. So if you're a lizard and you're trying to avoid a bird eating you, you've got very good camouflage. Your best strategy is just to sit still and hope that you're not seen. And that works quite well. A lot of our lizards, you'll see if you come across them in the wild and they haven't realized that you found them yet, they might have been moving, but then they'll all of a sudden just sort of like sit still and hope you haven't seen them. And then when you get within about half a metre, they'll run off as quickly as they can. If you're doing that same thing to try and avoid a cat or a rat from eating you, though, they hunt by scent, so you're basically just a sitting duck. And a lot of our lizards would have been wiped out. There's several species which no longer occur on the mainland because they're so sensitive to mammalian predators. Another big one is habitat destruction, so ongoing development and mining and all sorts of things are taking out lizard habitat. Another more sinister thing, which has happened a few times, is poaching for the illegal wildlife trade. So our native green geckos are unique globally because they're one of the only geckos in the world that's day active and bright green, and also very beautiful. So a lot of people overseas want them as pets. And there's been several instances recently of people trying to smuggle jewel geckos out of the country. And when you have small fragmented populations around the landscape, taking out 10 or 20 geckos at a time can have an impact. It's probably not as detrimental as the combined impact of habitat destruction and mammalian predators, but it's like another nail in the coffin, basically. And then another issue that's sort of become a bit more prominent, and we're realizing a bit more recently, is climate change. So just quickly, when we're talking about invasive predators and what makes the lizard more at risk from invasive mammals, there's three main risk factors. So if you're a very big lizard, you're too big to hide from things like rats and mice. If you're nocturnal, you're active at the same time as a lot of mammalian predators are active. And if you're terrestrial, so you're not climbing trees, then you're also kind of stuck on the ground and you're not able to escape. So if you're all of those three, if you're large, nocturnal and terrestrial, you're basically toast. And these two guys here, the robust skink and the McGregor skink, which are two quite big nocturnal skinks, and you can see they're not really built for climbing trees. They're pretty chunky and like sausages with little legs. They're stuck on the ground. So these two here would have been the first species to go extinct on the mainland following human arrival and the introduction of rats. And so these guys are only found on islands that have no mammalian predators whatsoever and never had. The bottom two are interesting because both species still occur on Great Barrier Island, which has some pests but not others. So it's like mustelids and some other things. But the Duversel's gecko, very, very big gecko, it's large and nocturnal, but it's partially arboreal. They can climb trees. So that's given them a little bit of an edge to get away from predators. The chevron skink, they are large and mostly terrestrial, but they're a diurnal species, so they're active during the day, and so that gives them a little bit of an edge to not have as high of a predation pressure on them. Interestingly though, chevron skinks do seem to climb a little bit in trees, and they're very cool. I'll talk about them a little bit later. And so I guess moving on, talking about climate change and a couple of case studies of how our lizards have been affected. So this is the cobble skink. It's a little species from the speckled skink group, and they were only discovered in 2007. And they were at one location. They were known from this one spot behind the pub in Granity on the west coast. Yes, good choice. But their specific habitat that they were living in was this narrow band of cobble right on the edge of the foreshore. And they noticed that it was eroding every year, a little bit was disappearing more and more. And when they did an assessment of the status of the species, they realized that they were critically endangered, only known from this one spot. And following year, there was a cyclone incoming that was basically going to wipe out all of the habitat. And so Doc had to make a difficult decision. What are we going to do about these? And so the entire known population at the time was salvaged from the wild and sent to Auckland Zoo. After the cyclone, all of the habitat was gone, and there's never been another cobble skink found behind the pub at Granity. And thankfully, the ones that were taken to the zoo bred in captivity. And so they ended up being able to release some more into the wild later. But thankfully, and even better for the cobble skink, with a bit more search effort, I believe it was maybe 2 years ago, they found a new population of cobble skinks where there was about 20,000 of them. So they realised that the ones at the zoo weren't as critical to the species survival anymore. But yeah, so I guess it's an example of how things could go wrong if storm events become more frequent. And we were just lucky that there were cobble skinks elsewhere that were in safer habitat and managed to survive. Another example, but on the opposite end of the spectrum, or opposite end of the habitat spectrum, I guess, orange-spotted geckos. So these are really cool, colourful alpine species. They're only found in areas above 1,600 metres around central Otago. And like the black-eyed gecko I was talking about earlier, their habitat is often covered with snow. They've got a very slow life history, so this is another one we believe has a very long pregnancy and probably lives around 70 years, but we haven't been monitoring them long enough to work that one out. And we believe that like some similar and related species, they probably would have lived in lowland areas previously. And so people wondered why they're only in these alpine areas. And the reason is, above the tree line where it gets very cold, you often get much lower numbers of mice and rats. And so a lot of our species which have been wiped out from areas in the lowlands have these refugia at quite high altitude where there's lower predator numbers and they're able to hang on. But with a warming climate, obviously those temperatures are going to increase and others might be pushed up further and further up the mountains. There's only so far they can go before they run out of habitat. So the future prospects for some of these alpine lizards might be a little bit dire unless we remove predators. So just a quick bit about looking for lizards. So how do you find them? So there's kind of two broad ways that we do this. One way is passive monitoring, passive surveying. So that means you're not interfering with the lizards at all. There's more active methods where you're putting out traps for them or things for them to hide under. And so a couple of passive methods you can use are tracking tunnels and visual searching. So tracking tunnels you'll be familiar with for monitoring pest numbers. And then visual searching is basically just going around some lizard habitat and looking for a lizard, sitting in a tree or sitting on a rock. And you can either do this during the day or at night, depending on the species. One is usually more effective than the other. And then you've also got more active monitoring methods. So artificial refuges. There's this material called onduline, which you can put on the ground to create like a nice little warm basking area for lizards. And then there's closed cell foam covers, which are kind of like the arboreal equivalent of that, which are basically like a foam wrap around a tree, which acts as like a little piece of loose bark for geckos to live under. You can also hand search for them, like many of us probably did as kids, like flipping rocks and logs in your garden looking for them. And then we also sometimes do live trapping, so you can use pitfall traps, which are basically just a bucket dug into the ground. That only works with skinks because obviously geckos can climb up. And we also use minnow traps, so like eel traps, like a funnel trap. And it's kind of crazy. You'd think a gecko would be able to find the way out, but they seem to work quite well. Once the gecko's in there, they just stay in there and don't often escape. But there are some clever ones we have seen escaping a couple of times. So these are the artificial refugia I was talking about. This is the onduline. So you put that on the ground, and because dark material warms up in the sun, and skinks like to sit under it or bask on top of it. And the same with the cell phone cover that's attached to a tree and is used for arboreal species like forest geckos and Pacific geckos. This is a tracking tunnel, and these are some footprints from a road-carved gecko on, I believe this was set out on territory in Ireland. And so these are just a few examples of what it's like looking for lizards in the wild. So in this photo, you're looking for a scree skink, looking out from between some rocks, and there he is, looking to get out. This is what it's like looking for jewel geckos in the east coast of the South Island, and there you go, sitting in there. Basically just looking for a green blob in the tree. That's a very obvious one. This is what it's like looking for forest geckos at night. They're often sitting on the branches of trees, and to go out with a torch, you're sometimes lucky enough to see one. And yeah, there he is sitting there. Here's another one. This is looking for green geckos again, but at night. In the same deal, you're looking for a green blob in a tree, and there she is there. And so once you've found lizards, if you're monitoring them, how do you know whether you're seeing the same individuals? So depending on how long you're monitoring them for, if it's just for a short period or over several years, there's two different things you can do. One thing we do, if it's for a very short period, seems a little bit mean, but you just write a number on it. So this was the 16th gecko we found on Motion Island when we were doing our survey. And this is quite good if you're doing a survey for maybe like a month or two. The problem is, as I'm sure a lot of you know, after a certain amount of time, lizards will shed their skin because they don't shed their skin in little pieces like we do over time. They shed it all at once, and it's basically to accommodate the lizard's growing body, and they keep growing throughout their lives. So every sort of 3 or 4 months, depending on how old the lizard is, they'll shed their skin, and so when they shed their skin, that comes off, and then you won't know if it's 16F or 17F or 100F that you found.
What sort of pin do you use?
So the best one is a xylene-free pin. I'm not sure what xylene is, but it's a little chemical in the pin that I think some people found irritated lizard skin. But these ones, when we were helping a researcher, that was just vivid, and it didn't seem to affect anything at all. But if you're monitoring lizards over a much longer period, a very cool thing that you can do is that every lizard has a pattern which is unique from every other individual, kind of like a face or a fingerprint for a person. Each lizard has a unique pattern that stays with it throughout its life. So it's born with that pattern, and sometimes it might fade a little bit, or the color might change, but the shape of the pattern will stay the same throughout its life. And so these are 3 Duversales geckos, and you can already see that there's quite distinct differences between them. And this one, all of its grey markings seem to kind of like link up down this side, and don't in these other 2. And then this one has a little gap between the first marking and the second marking, whereas this one's joined up. And the more you look, the more you'll see differences between them. And so you can build up a database of all the different lizards that you've been finding over the years. It's quite cool if you've not seen one for 10 years and you're like, oh, there's a Bob popped up again, So yeah, a really cool way of monitoring them, and a good way of getting some long-term data. And they live for so long that it's quite useful. It's quite useful information to have. And so, talking about lizards in Auckland, Auckland previously was a very, very diverse place for reptiles. So historically, we would have had up to 20 native lizard species in the Auckland area, and the Tuatara. Of those 20 though, 7 are now restricted entirely to islands. So these are the species that are like especially vulnerable to predation by mammals, and 5 are now regionally extinct. So these are species that would have populations north and south of Auckland, usually on islands, but they're not found on many of the islands or the mainland in the Auckland region anymore. We also have 1 introduced species, the rainbow skink or plague skink, which is obviously from Australia. And we have 1 Auckland endemic species, which has been recently described, and it's the Korowai gecko, which is this guy right here. And so if you're in your garden or local park, what might you expect to see? So there's around 4 species of native geckos that you might see out and about around the Auckland mainland, and up to 5 species of native skink. And then there's also rainbow skink from Australia, which is pretty much everywhere, you can't miss them. But these are the geckos you might come across. So the two most commonly encountered in Auckland are the forest gecko and the elegant gecko. So the elegant gecko is our local species of green gecko. And there's 9 different species distributed around the country in different regions. And the elegant gecko occurs roughly from Taupo north to around just south of the Bay of Islands, where it's taken over by the northern green gecko. And these guys are living mainly in things like Kanuka, red matipo, and they're very secretive. They're mainly in the canopies of trees, but sometimes if you're lucky, you might see one running across the footpath or around a bushwalk. I haven't had that happen to me yet, but there's a lot of people that tell me, like, I just saw them the other day. It was running across the path, and I've always had to, go out and look for them if I want to find them. Forest geckos, they're probably the most commonly encountered gecko in Auckland. A lot of people, especially if you live on the edge of a patch of native bush, you might have these living in your firewood pile or in your shed, or you might see them on a tree at night or basking on your deck. And they're very similar in build to the green geckos, the elegant gecko. You can see they've got quite long, skinny toes, and that's for grabbing onto foliage and moving around. So quite often these two, you'll find them living in the same sort of habitat. And they're able to coexist because the elegant gecko is diurnal, so active during the day, and the forest gecko is nocturnal. You often see them sort of, coexisting in that way. A third one that is slightly less common on the mainland, but is still kind of readily seen, is the Pacific gecko, which looks very similar to the forest gecko, but is a bit more blotchy. So if you wanted to tell the difference between them, probably the easiest way is to look at the pattern, particularly on the tail, and you can see it's almost like a series of big blotches, whereas this is kind of a series of zigzags and W's. And the only easy way to tell them apart from just, comparing the pattern, is they've got different coloured mouths. So the forest gecko has a orangey yellow mouth, the Pacific gecko has a pink mouth. But obviously, if you see a gecko in the wild, it's not going to open its mouth and show that to you. So, you're mainly just looking for the difference of pattern. And then the other two that you might find on the Auckland mainland are the Korowai gecko and the Raukawa gecko. So the Raukawa gecko is a very widespread species that occurs on the east coast of the North Island, as well as in some parts of the North and South Island. And I didn't put a photo on here because until recently we believed that they were extinct on the Auckland mainland, but Auckland Council has just found a mainland population at one of the regional parks on the southeast coast of Auckland. But the sister species of the Raukawa gecko is the Korowai gecko, which is this guy here, which is a very cool looking gecko. They named the Korowai gecko after the woven flax cloak, the Korowai, and that's basically just in honour of their striper pattern. And these guys were only discovered about 10 years ago, and because they were living the opposite coastline, we sort of had this idea that they might be genetically a little bit different to the ones on the east coast, the Raukawa geckos, and so they were genetically tested. And they are a different species, and so far they're only known from Muriwai Beach and a little island off the beach, and a very rare species, and that's our special Auckland endemic gecko. It's not found anywhere else at the moment. And so these are the skinks that you might see. Some of these you're probably more likely to see than others. These three on the right are the ones that people quite often have in their gardens. More so the bottom two. So this guy here, the copper skink, this is probably our most common lizard in Auckland. And the way you can distinguish these from other species is that they've got this very cool pattern on their mouth, which looks like a series of skeleton teeth, which we call a denticulate pattern. And that distinguishes them from the ornate skink, which is otherwise very similar looking, because this guy has just a little teardrop under the eye. It doesn't have the denticulate pattern. And even though these two might look fairly similar, they're quite distantly related. The ornate skink is actually related to a few quite rare species, which are now only on islands. And then the third species you might see in the garden is the plague skink or rainbow skink, which is from Australia. And they're just, basically, if you want to distinguish them, they're just very plain looking, don't really have much pattern on the back, and they've got this dark band down the side. One way that you often see posted on social media or in reports about how to tell the difference between them is that all of our native skinks have, so this scale here is called the frontoparietal scale, so it's kind of like on top of the head and behind the eyes. And so plague skinks or rainbow skinks have a single scale, whereas in all of our native skinks it's divided into two. But we have found some plague skinks which seem to have a split frontoparietal scale, and I also kind of feel like this is very unuseful because no one's ever going to get that close to a skink to be able to count the number of scales it's got in its head. And so these other three on the left-hand side here, these are a bit rarer. The shore skink, kind of like the roll-collar gecko and poodle gecko I was talking about before, restricted to the coastline, and so you've got different species living on the separate coastlines of Auckland. So you've got the shore skinks living on the east coast, and you get those in places like Shakespeare, Tawharanui, some of the other regional parks. Then on the opposite coastline, you've got a species called the Tātahi skink, which looks exactly the same. If you had two in the hand, you wouldn't be able to tell which one is which, but genetically they're quite different. They're obviously distinct populations, and so the Tātahi skink occurs from Auckland all the way up to Northland, and the shore skink sort of goes right down to the Bay of Plenty and a little bit further south, and all the way up to the North Island on the east coast. Another one, which is I'm in love with these. I think they're a really cool species. Is the moko skink. And these are a really distinctively striped species, very fast moving. It's almost like racing stripes. And they're very bold too. You'll quite often see them sitting out and basking, and they'll let you get very close to them. I remember being on an island once, which has lots of moko skinks, and we were sitting down waiting for dark so I could spot for geckos. And I had a couple of moko skinks come and just sit on the back of my hand while it's on the ground. So they're a very bold and active species. And they actually used to be the most common skink species on the Auckland mainland when Europeans first arrived. And now, the only place they occur on the mainland in Auckland is the Whangaparoa Peninsula. And otherwise, they're totally restricted to islands. So you'll quite often see them in places like Tiri Matangi, or if you're lucky, you might see them on Rangitoto. There's not quite as many out there, and they're on a lot of the islands in the Hauraki Gulf, but you don't really see them on the mainland too much anymore. And the third one of that group is probably the most mysterious. This is the striped skink, and so there's probably only been about 200 of these ever seen or recorded in New Zealand. They've got a very wide distribution. They're known from the Kaipara area through the Waitakeres down to Taranaki and across to Gisborne. But if we're lucky, we might only get 1 or 2 records of these a year. And the cool thing about these guys is that, unlike a lot of our skinks, they seem to be primarily arboreal. So they're living in the tops of trees and epiphytes. And because they're living way up there, 20, 30 meters above the ground, we have no idea how common or rare they are. And there's always a big argument between herpetologists every time we discuss how rare or common a species might be. Because there's a few people who are like, well, we're not seeing striped skinks, so maybe we should make them a threatened species. On the other hand, there's lots of habitat which is suitable for striped skinks that people would assume they're in, but so a very mysterious species. And I believe the last time they were seen in Auckland was in 2012. Someone actually found a couple under a log in their backyard in Titirangi, which is pretty cool. But yeah, if you see one of these, tell people, because it's a very interesting species that we need to learn more about. And so just a quick bit about rainbow skinks, or plain skinks as they're more commonly known now. Are they a threat? So they were introduced to Auckland accidentally in the 1960s. I think the first place they turned up was the Otahu rail yards. And since then they've spread through most of the North Island. They've recently established on Great Barrier, and they tried to get rid of them, but couldn't, so they're established there. And there's been 2 incursions in around the Marlborough Sounds, one in Blenheim. I believe they've managed to get rid of one of those incursions, but the other is pretty well established. And they're smaller than any of our native skinks, but reach huge densities. I'm sure, like many of you that have these in your garden, will see they're just kind of everywhere. As soon as they turn up, they just proliferate, and they're out on your deck and on your concrete, around your driveway. And so the main concern that people have had is that will these rainbow skinks outcompete our native skinks? And so most of the people have shown is that rainbow skinks are living in the same habitat, eating the same food as our native skinks, and there seems to be more of them, but no one's actually proven that the presence of rainbow skinks causes a negative impact on the native skinks. Where they have done some monitoring, like at Shakespeare Regional Park, they've noticed that the populations of rainbow skinks and native skinks seem to fluctuate independently of one another. However, there could be other potential problems that people are now sort of starting to look into. So because rainbow skinks evolved in Australia, where there's a lot of native mammals that would be eating them, they're much better at surviving where mammals are present. But because there are lots of lizards around, lots of plague skinks, that encourages other predators that are, will develop a search image just to look for a certain kind of prey to focus on skinks. And so native skinks might be a bit of collateral damage in that. You have a lot of kingfishers taking out rainbow skinks, but also eating your ornate skinks and copper skinks as well. And the rainbow skinks, because they breed very quickly, are able to bounce back relatively quickly, whereas the natives, which are very slow breeding, and slow to reach maturity, and just kind of decline. So yeah, one question we quite often have is, what do I do about plague skinks in my garden? Can I poison them? Can I control them? Can I trap them? And the problem is that anything you do to try and get rid of rainbow skinks will inevitably affect the native skinks, because you can't use traps, they'll catch native skinks. You can't put out baits or anything. You're just going to have an impact on native skinks as well. So what should you do? I think the most important thing is probably encourage habitat that native skinks will use over rainbow skinks, which is mostly for copper skinks and ornate skinks, things like rotten logs and leaf litter. Rainbow skinks seem to prefer like highly modified gardens that have lots of rock in them. So on the Auckland mainland, we've got all these other species, but what's missing? So it's those ones that are larger species, more susceptible to predation. Things like the Duvercells, geckos, and the robust skinks. These are completely extinct on the mainland now, so you're not gonna see them in your local forests and parks. Although there is a population of Duvercells geckos at Tawharanui. And the other thing is that we don't have the historic densities anymore, and with that, we don't have the same ecosystem function. So there's not as many lizards around, they're not pollinating as many plants, not dispersing as many seeds. So what can you do to help? Pest control, very important. Not just rats and stoats and cats. We actually think mice are a very underrated and important predator of native lizards. What we've actually found in several instances is if you control specifically rats and mustelids, the number of mice goes through the roof, and sometimes they completely take out the lizards you're trying to protect with your trapping. So it's kind of like this broad scale pest control is most beneficial to lizards. Planting native species that provide food and habitat for your local species of lizards. So for geckos in Auckland, there's things like Kānuka and red matipo, species that provide a really dense canopy for them to hide in are quite good. And for the type of skinks you're likely to get in your garden, things like flax and Mulungbeki and ringa are really good. Things that get like a nice dense litter underneath that provides a lot of humidity is quite good. So what you can do is you can create a lizard garden. Unfortunately, a lot of the resources out there are tailored for different species. So around Wellington and in the South Line, you get species like grass skinks, which prefer more rocky habitat, whereas for copper skinks and ornate skinks, which you're trying to create habitat for in Auckland, you're thinking about more leaf litter and woody debris, rotting logs, things like that would be very useful for them. Actually, some really good species for copper and ornate skinks, Tradescantia and dense kikuyu grass, which everyone hates and is trying to get rid of. But these guys absolutely love it. And the other thing is keep your cat indoors. That's always a good thing to help protect wildlife. So if you want to read a bit more, learn a bit more about our lizards, these are a few resources you can look at. I believe this is the most recent field guide written by a friend of ours, Zealand Herpetological. Very good photographer, very good herpetologist. It's an awesome book to have. Otherwise, there's the Herpetological Society website, which is completely free, and it's got information about all the species in New Zealand, as well as a bit of information and resources on people keeping lizards and people wanting to survey or monitor lizards, and issues about conservation. There's also the Department of Conservation website, but it's a little bit sparse on information about some of our species. I'm probably also a little bit biased because I helped make this one, but those are two resources you can look at to learn some more about lizards. And so that's my presentation. And yeah, I've got a few lizards for you guys to look at if you can.
Thank you.